Welcome to this journey into the shadows of American history, where the documented past collides with the unexplainable present. I'm your host, and tonight we descend into one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the post-Civil War South. A case that blurred the line between historical trauma and supernatural terror. Before we begin, I want to know, where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? Are you alone in the dark, or do you have company? Drop a comment below. It helps us understand our community, and honestly, knowing you're out there makes these stories a little less lonely to tell. The year is 1889. The place, Obion County, Tennessee, a region still bleeding from the wounds of the Civil War, where emancipation had come 2 decades prior, but true freedom remained an illusion for many. The Reconstruction era had collapsed, and the Jim Crow South was tightening its grip. In this landscape of broken promises and simmering violence, one man's terror would grip an entire county. His name was Anthony Lockhart, 67 years old, a freed slave who had survived bondage, war, and the treacherous years that followed. He lived alone in a weathered cabin on the outskirts of Union City, on land nobody else wanted, too close to the woods, too far from help. For decades, Anthony had been silent about his past, but in the summer of 1889, something changed. The screaming started in June. Night after night, locals reported hearing Anthony's voice cutting through the darkness, hoarse and desperate. The eyes are watching again. Some thought he'd lost his mind. Others whispered that he'd always been touched by something darker. The county's black community, still reeling from recent lynchings and systematic oppression, kept their distance, not out of fear of Anthony, but fear of what attention his condition might bring. Then, on the morning of September 14th, 1889, a traveling preacher discovered Anthony's body. The scene was so disturbing that Sheriff Thomas Whitmore, a man who'd seen his share of war atrocities, reportedly vomited outside the cabin before composing himself enough to investigate. Anthony Lockhart lay on the floor of his one-room home. Both eyes had been removed, not surgically, but violently torn from their sockets. His fingers were bloody, nails broken. The initial assumption was self-mutilation in a fit of madness. But then the investigators noticed the walls, carved into every wooden surface, the door, frame, the support beams, the makeshift table, were symbols. Not random scratches, but deliberate patterns, circles within circles, eyes with radiating lines, strange geometric shapes that resembled nothing in Christian iconography or Native American art known to the region. And surrounding these symbols, scratched in desperate, uneven letters, "They see, they see, they see, they see." The Obion County Gazette ran the story on page 3, beneath livestock prices. Elderly Negro found dead in cabin, sheriff suspects insanity. But the official record tells only a fraction of what investigators actually found. And what they found suggests this wasn't just a tragic death. It was the culmination of a curse that had followed Anthony Lockhart for over 60 years. A curse that may have been intentionally placed upon him during the darkest days of American slavery. What were the witch eyes that haunted Anthony Lockhart? Why did his terror intensify in his final summer? And what did investigators discover in the weeks following his death that made them quietly close the case and burn certain evidence? This is the story they didn't want told. The case that terrified Obion County. The mystery that remains unsolved to this day. To understand what happened to Anthony Lockhart in 1889, we must first travel back to 1822, the year of his birth on the Thornhill Plantation, approximately 40 miles south of Union City. The Thornhill estate was a modest operation by plantation standards, consisting of roughly 800 acres of cotton and tobacco fields worked by 32 enslaved people. The plantation was owned by Silas Thornhill, a third-generation landowner whose family had migrated from Virginia in the late 1700s. Historical records describe Silas as an educated man, unusual for rural Tennessee. He'd studied briefly at a seminary in Charleston before returning home to manage the family estate after his father's death in 1820. But Silas Thornhill was educated in more than theology. According to fragmentary accounts from the Tennessee Historical Society archives, Silas maintained an extensive library, unusual not for its size, but for its content. Estate auction records from 1866, after the plantation's collapse, list several curious volumes, texts on European mysticism, grimoires attributed to medieval occultists, and at least 3 books on what period documents vaguely termed African spiritual practices. This detail becomes crucial to our story, because Silas Thornhill, it seems, wasn't just interested in controlling the bodies of the enslaved people on his land. He wanted to control something deeper. Slavery in the American South operated through multiple systems of terror. Physical violence, certainly, but also psychological warfare. Enslaved people were systematically stripped of their names, their languages, their religions, their family structures. Yet African spiritual traditions proved remarkably resilient, adapting and surviving through syncretism and secrecy. Slaveholders feared these practices, viewing them as potential sources of resistance. Some, like Silas Thornhill, apparently sought to co-opt them. The Thornhill plantation gained a dark reputation among the enslaved community across western Tennessee. In oral histories collected by the WPA Federal Writers Project in the 1930s, 40 years after Anthony's death, elderly former slaves from the region referenced Thornhill in hushed terms. One interview, conducted with a woman named Eliza Washington, aged 94, includes this passage. "My grandmother, she knew people from that Thornhill place. Said the master there he'd done things, dark things. Made people do rituals in the woods at night. If you disobeyed, you got marked. Not just whipped, marked in ways you couldn't see but couldn't escape neither." Anthony Lockhart was born into this environment. Records indicate his mother was named Sarah, purchased from a slave market in Nashville in 1820. His father's identity remains unknown. Possibly another enslaved person on the plantation. Possibly Silas Thornhill himself. Such ambiguities were tragically common. What we know with certainty is that Anthony worked the fields from age 6, as was standard practice, but something happened to him around age 10 that set him apart. Multiple sources reference this, though details remain frustratingly vague. A notation in Silas Thornhill's personal ledger from 1832 reads, "Boy Anthony, marked for special observation. Ritual completed successfully. Continue monitoring for signs." What ritual? What signs? The ledger offers no explanation. But from that point forward, according to later testimonies, young Anthony began exhibiting strange behaviors. He would wake screaming, claiming something was watching him. He refused to work after sunset, becoming violent if forced. He carved protective symbols into trees, symbols that disturbed even the other enslaved people, who warned him to stop. By age 15, Anthony had attempted to run away 3 times. Each time, he was caught and brutally punished. But interestingly, Silas Thornhill never sold him, never transferred him to another plantation. He kept Anthony close, almost as if he were observing an experiment. The Civil War erupted in 1861. Tennessee, a border state, was torn apart by divided loyalties. The Thornhill plantation, like many southern estates, struggled as the conflict dragged on. Silas Thornhill died in 1863, not in battle, but under mysterious circumstances in his own study. His body was discovered by his wife, surrounded by candles and open books. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure. He was 49 years old. With Silas dead and the Confederacy collapsing, The Thornhill plantation fell into chaos. By 1865, Union forces had occupied western Tennessee, and the Emancipation Proclamation had technically freed all enslaved people in rebellious states. Anthony Lockhart, now 43 years old, walked away from the only home he'd ever known. But freedom came with its own terrors. The Reconstruction era in Tennessee was marked by extreme violence against newly freed black Americans. The Ku Klux Klan originated in nearby Pulaski, Tennessee in 1865. Lynchings were common. Economic opportunities were virtually non-existent. Many freed people found themselves trapped in sharecropping arrangements that replicated slavery in all but name. Anthony Lockhart chose isolation instead. Using meager savings earned through odd jobs, he purchased a small plot of land on the outskirts of Union City in 1871. The land was cheap because locals considered it unlucky. Too close to the woods, where, according to local legend, Confederate deserters had hidden and eventually died. Anthony built a small cabin with his own hands and lived there alone for 18 years. During that time, he interacted with the community minimally. He sold vegetables at the market. He attended the Black Baptist Church. Sporadically, he never married, never had children. Those who knew him described a quiet man who seemed older than his years, who flinched at sudden movements, who always appeared to be listening for something just beyond hearing. The Obion County Census of 1880 lists him simply: Anthony Lockhart, Negro, age 58, farmer, unmarried, literate. That last detail is notable. Very few enslaved people of his generation had learned to read and write. How Anthony acquired this skill remains unknown, though it would prove significant, because Anthony Lockhart kept journals, and those journals, discovered after his death, told a story far stranger than anyone expected. This was the world Anthony Lockhart inhabited on the eve of his final, terrifying summer. A world still haunted by the ghost of slavery, a world where the past refused to stay buried, a world where something, whether curse, trauma, or genuine supernatural force, was about to manifest with horrifying finality. The first documented incident of Anthony's renewed terror occurred on June 3rd, 1889. That evening, the widow Martha Reynolds, who lived approximately half a mile from Anthony's cabin, reported hearing the most god-awful screaming coming from the direction of his property. She described it as not like a man being hurt, but like a man seeing something no man should see. Martha's son, Daniel, aged 19, grabbed a rifle and went to investigate. What he found disturbed him enough that he reported it to Sheriff Whitmore the following morning. According to Daniel's statement, preserved in the county records, I found Mr. Lockhart standing in his yard, stone still, staring at his cabin door. I called to him, but he didn't turn. When I got closer, I could see he was shaking something terrible. His eyes were wide and he kept whispering, "They're back. After all these years, they're back." I asked him what was back, and he finally looked at me. I ain't ashamed to say it scared me, the look in his eyes. He said, "The witch eyes, the master's eyes, they found me again." Daniel tried to calm Anthony, eventually convincing him to go inside. But as Daniel was leaving, Anthony grabbed his arm with surprising strength and said something that Daniel never forgot. "It's the anniversary." He said it would come back on the anniversary. 60 years of watching, waiting. Now it's time for the collection. Sheriff Whitmore's initial response was dismissive. Anthony Lockhart was known to be peculiar, and the sheriff had more pressing concerns: a string of burglaries in town, ongoing tensions with the railroad company. He filed Daniel's report and forgot about it. But the incidents continued. On June 10th, the pastor of First Baptist Church, colored, Reverend Isaiah Washington, visited Anthony at the cabin after he'd missed 3 consecutive Sunday services. The Reverend's account, recorded in his personal diary, provides chilling detail. I found Brother Lockhart in a state of profound distress. His cabin was dark, all windows covered with cloth. He would not let me inside. When I asked after his health, he said, "Reverend, I am being watched, every moment, every breath. The eyes I thought I'd escaped have found me." I attempted to pray with him, to counsel him that the Lord protects the faithful. He laughed, a terrible, bitter sound. "The Lord didn't protect me when I was 10 years old. He won't start now." I asked what happened when he was 10. He would not answer directly, but said, "The old master put something in me, a mark you can't see. And now, after all these years of quiet, it's waking up." Reverend Washington left troubled. He mentioned Anthony's condition to several church elders, and they agreed to check on him regularly. But Anthony began refusing visitors entirely. On June 18th, a traveling salesman named Herbert Moss stopped at Anthony's property, hoping to sell him tools. He knocked on the door for several minutes before Anthony finally answered, but only opened the door a crack. Moss later told others in town that Anthony's cabin interior was completely dark despite it being midday, and that every inch of visible wall space was covered in drawings. "Eyes," Moss said. "Hundreds of eyes, all staring out. And Mr. Lockhart, he looked like he hadn't slept in days, kept glancing over his shoulder like someone was standing behind him." The black community in Obion County began to talk. Older residents recalled stories from their parents and grandparents about the Thornhill plantation, about Silas Thornhill's midnight rituals, about enslaved people who'd been marked and subsequently plagued by nightmares and visions. Some suggested Anthony was experiencing what they called haint sickness, a spiritual affliction caused by curses or unfinished business with the dead. A small group of women from the church prepared food and left it on Anthony's doorstep. Sometimes it was taken, sometimes it rotted where it sat. On July 4th, Independence Day grimly. Ironic, a teenage boy named Samuel Porter was dared by his friends to peek through Anthony's window after dark. What Samuel claimed to see would fuel rumors for years. According to Samuel's breathless account to his mother that night, there was light inside, but it wasn't from no lamp or candle. It was like fireflies, but wrong, blue-green colored. And Mr. Lockhart was on his knees in the middle of the room, and he was talking to something. I couldn't see nothing there, but he was talking like someone was answering back. And then, I swear on the Bible, Mama, I saw two lights like eyes appear in the darkness across from him. They just hung there in the air, glowing. Mr. Lockhart screamed and covered his face, and I ran. Tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. Is this the manifestation of a genuine curse? The psychological breakdown of a traumatized man? Or something else entirely? Your theories might align with what investigators eventually discovered, or they might take us in directions even darker than the truth. Sheriff Whitmore, finally pressured by concerned citizens, visited Anthony's cabin on July 20th. He brought Deputy James Crawford with him. The sheriff's official report is brief, almost suspiciously so. Visited Lockhart property. Subject appears mentally unsound, but poses no immediate threat to others. Recommended observation by community members. But Deputy Crawford's personal notes, discovered decades later in his granddaughter's attic, tell a different story. The sheriff won't put this in the official record, but I need to write it down while it's fresh. That cabin, something's wrong there. We could feel it before we even got to the door, like the air was thicker, harder to breathe. Mr. Lockhart finally let us in, and I've never seen anything like it. Every surface covered in carvings and drawings, eyes, symbols I didn't recognize. He'd written things on the walls too, over and over. The anniversary approaches. The collection is coming. 60 years of watching. I asked him what anniversary. He looked at me like I was stupid and said, "June 14th, 1832, the night Master Thornhill marked me, the night he put the witch eyes inside me." I asked what he meant. He pulled up his shirt, and there on his chest was a scar, old, faded, but deliberate, a circle with radiating lines, like an eye. He said Master Thornhill had performed a ritual, cut that symbol into his chest when he was 10 years old, told him he'd placed watchers inside him, and that they would observe his entire life. 70 years of watching, Thornhill had said. After 70 years, the watchers would come to collect what they'd seen, to take his eyes so they could deliver them to Thornhill in whatever hell he inhabited. The sheriff told Mr. Lockhart that was superstitious nonsense, that Silas Thornhill had been dead for 26 years. Mr. Lockhart smiled, the saddest smile I ever saw. "The dead don't stop working. They're evil, Deputy. They just work it from farther away." We left. The sheriff said we'd check on him again in a week, but I'll be honest, I don't want to go back there. Something in that cabin felt wrong, and those symbols on the walls. I've seen African spiritual markings before, and I've seen voodoo symbols in New Orleans. These were neither. These were something else, something older maybe, something worse. The week passed, then 2 more. August arrived, brutally hot even by Tennessee standards, and Anthony Lockhart's screaming grew worse. Now it was nightly, continuous. Neighbors reported that he shouted not just about the eyes, but conversations, as if arguing with someone unseen. "I won't let you," he'd scream. "You can't have them. They're mine." On September 1st, the screaming suddenly stopped. The silence, neighbors later said, was somehow more disturbing than the noise had been. For 13 days, no one saw Anthony Lockhart. No smoke rose from his chimney. No movement was visible around the property. It was as if the cabin itself had become a tomb, and in a way it had. Traveling preacher Elijah Moss arrived in Union City on September 13th, 1889. A circuit minister serving small black congregations across western Tennessee, Moss made a practice of visiting isolated members of the community. Reverend Washington had mentioned Anthony Lockhart's troubles, and Moss, experienced in counseling people through spiritual crises, decided to check on the elderly man. He approached the cabin at approximately 9:00 a.m. on September 14th. The morning was already hot, humid, the kind of oppressive heat that makes breathing feel like work. Moss later testified that he noticed the smell before he reached the door. Not decay exactly, though that was present. Something else, something acrid and wrong, like burnt hair and metal. The door was slightly ajar. Moss called out. No answer. He pushed the door open and immediately recoiled. The smell intensified. The interior was dark, all windows still covered, but enough morning light spilled through the open door to illuminate the scene. Anthony Lockhart lay on his back in the center of the one-room cabin. His arms were spread wide, his legs straight. The positioning seemed almost ritualistic, too deliberate for a natural death. His clothes were soaked with blood, primarily concentrated around his face. Moss, despite his horror, stepped inside. As his eyes adjusted, the full extent of the scene became clear. Anthony's eye sockets were empty, dark cavities that seemed to stare at nothing and everything simultaneously. Blood had run down his face, pooling beneath his head. His fingers were bloody up to the second knuckle, nails broken and torn. Scattered around his body were small pieces of tissue. Moss realized with revulsion that these were fragments of Anthony's own eyes. But it was the walls that truly horrified the preacher. Every single surface was carved with symbols. The work must have taken days, possibly weeks. Deep gouges in the wood, some still showing splinters. The symbols were variations on a theme. Circles with radiating lines, eye-like patterns, geometric shapes that seemed to shift and move in the flickering light. And the words, hundreds of words, carved and written in what appeared to be blood, charcoal, and other substances Moss couldn't identify. They see, they see, they see. The anniversary has come. 60 years of watching complete. The collection is here. Master. Thornhill sends his regards from the dark. The witch eyes have taken their payment. On the small table beside Anthony's body, Moss discovered a pile of notebooks, journals, written in a surprisingly steady hand, despite the chaos surrounding them. The most recent entry was dated September 13th, the day before Moss's arrival. The final page was left open, as if Anthony had wanted someone to find it. Moss, his hands shaking, read the last entry. It is finished. They came for me last night, just as he said they would. 60 years ago tomorrow, on June 14th, 1832, Master Thornhill cut the witch eyes into my flesh. He said they would watch my entire life, every moment, every breath, every sin, and every joy. And after 70 years of watching, they would come to collect, to take my eyes back to him in whatever darkness he inhabits. I thought perhaps I had miscounted, that maybe I was safe. But the dead don't forget their contracts. The witch eyes remembered. They've been here for 3 days now. I can see them even with my eyes closed, glowing in the darkness, staring, always staring. They whisper in his voice, Master Thornhill's voice, unchanged by death. He tells me it's time to pay what I owe, time to give up my eyes so they can finally stop watching and return to their maker. I tried to refuse. God knows I tried. But you can't refuse the dead when they've planted their hooks in you so young. The mark on my chest burns like he's cutting it into me all over. Again. If someone finds this, tell them it was real. The witch eyes were real. This wasn't madness. This was a curse that waited 70 years to complete itself. And if there are others out there who were marked by Master Thornhill, and I know there were, I saw them in the woods during his rituals, tell them to beware their own anniversaries. The dead are patient, but they always collect their debts. Moss ran from the cabin and immediately sought the sheriff. Sheriff Thomas Whitmore arrived, with Deputy Crawford and 2 other men at approximately 11:02 a.m. Whitmore's official report describes the scene in clinical terms. Subject appears to have expired due to self-inflicted injuries. Evidence suggests severe mental disturbance. No signs of forced entry or struggle with another party, but the sheriff's private correspondence, discovered years later, reveals his true reaction. In a letter to his brother dated September 20th, 1889, Whitmore wrote, I have seen men torn apart by cannon fire. I have seen women and children dead from disease and starvation, but I have never seen anything that disturbed me quite like Anthony Lockhart's cabin. It wasn't just the violence of his death, though that was horrific enough. It was the atmosphere of the place. You could feel something lingering there. Something that watched you while you worked. My men wanted to leave within minutes. I had to order them to stay. We spent 4 hours documenting the scene, and every one of those hours felt like swimming through darkness. The symbols on the walls weren't random. They had a pattern, a logic, as if they were meant to be read by someone or something other than human eyes. We collected his journals. 23 notebooks spanning decades. I've begun reading them, though I'm not sure I should. What I've found so far suggests Anthony Lockhart was telling the truth about at least some of his claims. There was a ritual, there was a marking, and he wasn't the only one. The investigation expanded reluctantly. Whitmore interviewed members of the black community who'd known Anthony, as well as elderly white residents who remembered the Thornhill plantation. What emerged was a pattern of stories that had been circulating quietly for decades, stories the white establishment had dismissed as superstition. An elderly woman named Cora Baines, age 78, testified that her cousin had worked at Thornhill Plantation and spoke of marking ceremonies that occurred periodically. Master Thornhill, he'd pick certain children, young ones around 10 years old. He'd take them into the woods at night, do something to them. They'd come back changed, quiet, scared. Some of them would start having fits, seeing things. A few ran away, never seen again, most just endured. A man named Joshua Freeman, age 71, who'd been enslaved on a neighboring plantation, recalled, "We all knew about Thornhill's witch eyes. That's what folks called it." He claimed he'd learned it from some African spiritual practice, but twisted it somehow, combined it with European magic or devil worship or something. The children he marked, they'd carry that mark their whole lives. Some said he was trying to create his own network of spies, that through the marks he could see through their eyes, know what they knew. Others said it was darker, that he was feeding something, building power for himself by stealing pieces of other people's souls. Deputy Crawford, following. Leads from Anthony's journals, travelled to the ruins of the Thornhill Plantation. The main house had burned in 1867, but the foundation remained, along with several outbuildings. In what had been Silas Thornhill's study, identifiable by remnants of bookshelves, Crawford made a disturbing discovery. Beneath the floorboards, hidden in a space that had somehow survived the fire, Crawford found a metal box. Inside were papers, some burnt, some water-damaged, but several still legible. These included what appeared to be Silas Thornhill's personal notes on his studies. The documents were written in a mixture of English, Latin, and symbols Crawford couldn't decipher. One fragment, translated later by a professor of classical languages at Vanderbilt University, read, "The eyes must be placed young, before the soul solidifies. The mark binds the watcher to the watched. For 70 years, a biblical span, a complete life, the watcher observes, collecting the essence of sight itself. On the anniversary of the marking's completion, the watcher returns to claim the physical eyes, bringing them back to the master regardless of his mortal state. Thus, the master sees beyond death, through the eyes of those he marked in life." Anthony's journals provided names. 14 other children who'd been marked during Thornhill's rituals between 1828 and 1863. Sheriff Whitmore, despite his limited resources and the racial politics of the era, felt compelled to investigate. What he discovered suggested Anthony Lockhart wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a pattern that had played out across decades. A freedman named Jacob Turner had died in 1882 at age 67 in Nashville. The death certificate listed accidental injury, but the physician's private notes, obtained through correspondence, described something far stranger. Patient's eyes appeared to have been removed, though whether by his own hand or another's remains unclear. Family reported patient had been suffering paranoid delusions about eyes in the darkness for several weeks prior to death. Jacob Turner had been marked in 1830, according to Thornhill's notes, 52 years before his death. Not quite the 70-year span, but close enough to be noteworthy. A woman named Martha Lee had died in 1878 at age 58 in Memphis. Hospital records described her final days. Patient exhibited extreme photophobia and paranoid fixations, claimed she was being watched constantly. On her final night, she scratched at her own eyes repeatedly despite restraints, expired due to infection resulting from self-inflicted wounds. Martha had been marked in 1828, according to the documents, 50 years before her death. The pattern was inconsistent in timing but consistent in nature. Those who'd been marked during Thornhill's rituals experienced some form of violent death related to their eyes, usually accompanied by paranoid claims of being watched. Some deaths occurred around the 50-year mark, others around 60 years. Anthony's had come at 67 years, nearly the full biblical 70. But here's what made the pattern even more disturbing. Not all the marked children could be accounted for. Of the 14 names in Thornhill's documents, only 7 had documented deaths. The other 7 had seemingly vanished from all records after emancipation. No death certificates, no census entries, no property records, nothing. They'd simply disappeared. Deputy Crawford developed a theory that he shared only with Sheriff Whitmore. What if some of them are still out there, still waiting for their anniversary? If Thornhill marked children from the late 1820s through the early 1860s, and the curse takes up to 70 years to complete, then there could be people alive right now, in 1889, who are approaching their collection date. The thought was chilling. Somewhere in Tennessee, in neighboring states, there might be elderly men and women, all former slaves of Silas Thornhill, who were living under the same curse that had claimed Anthony Lockhart, and their time was running out. Whitmore attempted to pursue this angle, but found himself blocked at multiple levels. The white establishment wasn't interested in investigating the deaths of elderly black people, particularly if those investigations involved validating superstitious claims about curses and dark magic. The black community was reluctant to speak openly about these matters to white authorities, fearing repercussions or ridicule. The investigation stalled. By October 1889, Sheriff Whitmore had quietly closed the case. The official verdict: Anthony Lockhart died by self-mutilation during a psychotic episode, likely triggered by age-related dementia. The symbols, the journals, the pattern of similar deaths, all dismissed as coincidental or irrelevant. But Whitmore kept Anthony's journals. He kept Silas Thornhill's notes. He kept Deputy Crawford's reports about the missing marked individuals. And, in his private correspondence, he wrote, "I don't know if I believe in curses, but I know Anthony Lockhart believed, and I know 7 other people died in similar circumstances. And I know there are 7 more people we can't account for. Sometimes not knowing is worse than any truth." The most haunting physical evidence of Anthony's claims came during the preparation of his body for burial. The local black community, despite their fear and confusion about the circumstances of his death, insisted he receive a proper Christian burial. Undertaker Moses Williams, one of the few black business owners in Union City, was charged with preparing the body. Williams later told Reverend Washington that he'd never forget what he saw when he removed Anthony's shirt. On the left side of Anthony's chest, directly over his heart, was a scar. Even after 67 years, it remained visible, a raised, discolored patch of skin roughly 3 inches in diameter. The scar depicted exactly what Anthony had described: a circle with radiating lines like a stylized eye. But there was more. Within the circle were additional symbols, smaller geometric patterns that seemed to have been carved with extraordinary precision. How a child could have survived such a procedure, performed without anesthesia, likely without proper sterilization, defied Williams's medical understanding. It wasn't just a scar, Williams told the Reverend. It was like a brand, but deeper, like whatever made it had been trying to mark not just his skin, but something underneath. The flesh around it was wrong, discolored in a way I'd never seen, not from age, not from infection, something else. Williams photographed the scar, one of the few photographs taken during the entire investigation. The image was stored in the Obion County Records Office, where it remained forgotten for decades. When it was rediscovered in the 1950s during a renovation, the photograph caused considerable debate among those who saw it. The scar appeared to have properties that shouldn't have been possible with 1880s photography techniques. In certain lighting angles, the symbols seemed to possess depth, as if they extended beneath the skin. Some viewers claimed they could see additional markings in the photograph that weren't visible to the naked eye, patterns that seemed to shift depending on how the image was held. Dr. Harold Simmons, a professor of anthropology at Vanderbilt University, who examined the photograph in 1963, noted, "This marking bears no resemblance to any documented African scarification practices I've encountered, nor does it match European occult traditions, though there are superficial similarities to certain medieval grimoire illustrations. If I had to categorize it, I'd say it represents a synthesis. Someone took knowledge from multiple sources and created something new, something experimental." But perhaps most disturbing was what Moses Williams discovered when he washed Anthony's body more thoroughly. The primary scar over his heart wasn't the only marking. There were secondary scars, much smaller, barely visible, on Anthony's temples, behind his ears, and at the base of his skull. These marks formed a pattern, as if mapping pathways to his eyes. Williams sketched what he'd found and showed it to a traveling physician who happened to be in Union City that week. The physician, Dr. Edmund Cross, had studied anatomy in Philadelphia and possessed more advanced medical knowledge than most rural practitioners. His assessment, recorded in a letter to Williams, added another layer of horror to the case. "The markings you've sketched follow, with disturbing accuracy, the path of the optic nerves and associated neural pathways. Whoever created these scars possessed knowledge of cranial anatomy that would be exceptional even for a trained surgeon of this era, let alone someone working in rural Tennessee in the 1830s. The precision required to mark these locations without causing immediate death from infection or brain damage is extraordinary. The primary mark over the heart, combined with these secondary marks, suggests to me an attempt to create a physical connection between the heart, often considered the seat of the soul in older traditions, and the eyes. Whether for occult purposes or some bizarre physiological experiment, I cannot say, but the intent seems clear: to literally wire the victim's vision to some central point of control. Anthony Lockhart was buried on September 18, 1889, in the segregated section of Union City Cemetery. Reverend Washington performed the service. Approximately 30 people attended, far more than expected given the circumstances. The black community, despite their fear, recognized that Anthony deserved dignity in death, whatever had tormented him in life. The grave was marked with a simple wooden cross bearing his name and dates. That cross rotted away within a decade. His grave is now unmarked, its exact location lost to time. But those who attended his funeral recalled one final, inexplicable detail. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, a sudden wind swept through the cemetery, despite the day being utterly still moments before. And several people swore they heard, just for an instant, a sound like distant screaming, then nothing but silence. The Anthony Lockhart case faded from public consciousness quickly. By 1890, it was rarely discussed even in Union City. The official records gathered dust. Silas Thornhill's recovered documents were filed away in the county archives, unexamined and largely forgotten. Life moved on, as it always does, leaving the dead and their mysteries behind. But the story didn't end with Anthony's burial. Over the following decades, fragments of the case would resurface in unexpected ways, each discovery adding new dimensions and new questions to the original mystery. In the spring of 1924, a construction crew working on a new road near the site of the old Thornhill plantation unearthed something disturbing. Approximately 3 feet beneath the surface, in what had once been wooded land adjacent to the plantation's fields, they discovered a series of small stone markers. Beneath each marker was a shallow burial containing human remains, specifically human skulls. 7 skulls in total. All showed evidence of trauma, specifically to the eye sockets, which had been deliberately carved and enlarged post-mortem. Inside several of the skulls, the workers found small metal objects, crude amulets or charms bearing symbols similar to those found in Anthony Lockhart's cabin 35 years earlier. The county coroner at the time, Dr. Wallace Patterson, examined the remains. His report, preserved in medical archives, estimated the remains were 60 to 80 years old, placing the death somewhere between 1844 and 1864. The skulls belonged to adults of various ages. Several showed signs of healed injuries consistent with the brutal treatment of enslaved people. Dr. Patterson's notes included a chilling observation. Each skull shows identical marks around the eye sockets, circular incisions with radiating grooves. These marks were made with considerable care, suggesting ritualistic purpose rather than mere mutilation. The amulets found within the skulls contain symbols I cannot identify. Local historians have suggested these might be connected to the Silas Thornhill case from old county records, though details are scarce. The discovery briefly made local newspapers, but was quickly dismissed as a historical curiosity. The remains were reburied in an unmarked location. The metal amulets were catalogued and stored in the County Historical Society, where they remained until the building burned down in 1947, destroying most of its collections. But one person took special interest in the discovery: James Lockhart, Anthony's nephew, who was living in Memphis at the time. James, who'd been a child when his uncle died, had grown up, hearing family stories about Anthony's final months. The discovery of those 7 skulls convinced him that his uncle's claims had been truthful. James began his own investigation, corresponding with elderly former slaves across Tennessee and neighboring states. He was trying to find the 7 missing individuals from Silas Thornhill's list, the marked children who disappeared from all records after emancipation. His research, compiled in a series of letters and notebooks now held by his descendants, suggested a grim possibility. Those 7 skulls might have belonged to the 7 missing marked individuals. Perhaps they hadn't escaped Thornhill's curse at all. Perhaps they'd been collected earlier, their deaths unrecorded, their bodies buried in secret on the plantation grounds. James wrote in one letter, "I believe Uncle Anthony survived as long as he did because he left the plantation immediately after emancipation and never returned. Those who stayed nearby or who were somehow drawn back to Thornhill land were collected sooner. The curse operated on proximity as well as time. The closer you remained to the source of the marking, the faster it completed its work." In 1958, during an estate sale following Sheriff Whitmore's granddaughter's death, a box of documents was purchased by a local history enthusiast named Margaret Chambers. Among the documents were Anthony Lockhart's journals, the very journals that had been confiscated during the original investigation and supposedly lost. Chambers, fascinated by what she read, contacted the State Historical Society and several universities. The journals were eventually examined by Dr. Theodore Morrison, a psychiatrist at Vanderbilt University who specialized in trauma-related disorders. Dr. Morrison's analysis, published in a limited circulation academic journal, approached the case from a psychological rather than supernatural perspective. Anthony Lockhart's journals depict a textbook case of complex PTSD resulting from childhood trauma. The marking ceremony, he describes, if it occurred, was almost certainly sexual and physical abuse, framed in occult terms to further terrorize and control enslaved children. The witch eyes likely represent a dissociative mechanism, a way for Lockhart's mind to externalize his trauma. The timing of his breakdown, nearly 60 years after the initial trauma, is consistent with delayed PTSD symptom emergence, often triggered by anniversary dates or regression into traumatic memories during the aging process. His final act of self-harm, while horrific, represents an attempt to exert control over his own narrative, to finally end the watching, that had traumatized him since childhood. Morrison's interpretation was clinically sound and compassionate. It offered a rational explanation for Anthony's suffering, but it couldn't explain certain physical evidence: the consistency of the scarring patterns across multiple victims, the deliberate nature of the symbols, or the deaths of others marked by Thornhill that followed similar patterns. Dr. Morrison himself acknowledged this in his conclusion. While psychological trauma undoubtedly played a significant role in Lockhart's suffering, there remain aspects of this case that resist purely psychiatric interpretation. The physical evidence suggests organized, systematic abuse with consistent methodology across multiple victims over decades. Whether Silas Thornhill's rituals possessed any supernatural efficacy is beyond the scope of medical inquiry, but their psychological efficacy, their power to destroy lives across decades, is undeniable. In 1971, an elderly man named Robert Kensington died in Nashville. While sorting through his belongings, his daughter discovered a manuscript titled "What I Saw in Obion County, a Photographer's Testament." Kensington had been a traveling photographer who'd passed through Union City in August 1889, just weeks before Anthony Lockhart's death. In his manuscript, Kensington described an unsettling encounter. He'd been taking photographs of rural scenes for a series on post-war Southern life when he noticed Anthony's cabin. The dilapidated structure had appealed to his artistic sensibility, so he'd set up his equipment to photograph it. "As I worked," Kensington wrote, "I became aware of a presence at the cabin window, a man, elderly, Negro, watching me. His expression was difficult to describe. Not hostile, not fearful. More like desperate warning. He gestured frantically for me to leave. Being young and foolish, I ignored him and completed my photographs. When I developed the plates later, I noticed something peculiar. In every photograph of the cabin, there appeared to be anomalies. Spots of light, where none should exist, concentrated near the windows and door. At first I assumed these were defects in the glass plates or errors in development. But the pattern was too consistent. The lights appeared in each image, always in the same locations, always with the same blue-green tint that multiple witnesses had described seeing around the property. More disturbing, when I enlarged one image, the spots of light resolved into shapes. They looked unmistakably like eyes. Dozens of them, hovering in the air around the cabin, all focused on the windows, all watching the man inside." Kensington claimed he attempted to publish these photographs in various journals, but was rejected by all. He eventually destroyed the plates, keeping only his written account. "Whatever was happening in that cabin," he concluded, "was not meant to be captured by camera. Some darkness, once documented, spreads." Perhaps the most poignant fragment emerged in 1987, when a woman named Dorothy Henshaw, aged 92, was interviewed for a local oral history project in Memphis. Dorothy's grandmother had been enslaved at Thornhill Plantation until emancipation. During the interview, when asked about family stories from the slavery era, Dorothy suddenly became emotional. "Grandmama told me about the marked children, said she was there the night they marked a little boy named Anthony. Said Master Thornhill took him into the woods, and when he came back hours later the boy was different, quiet, scared, had a bandage on his chest. Grandmama said she tried to help Anthony over the years, tried to mother him since his own mama had been sold away, but he'd wake up screaming every night saying the eyes were watching him. She thought he'd never know peace." After the war, Grandmama never saw Anthony again. But she told me before she died, this was in 1904, I was just 9 years old, she said, "Dorothy, I pray every day that Anthony found some peace. But I don't think he did. Master Thornhill was too strong. His evil was too deep. Some wounds, they don't heal even after death." Dorothy then shared something that had never been documented before. Grandmama said there was one other child who was marked and survived to old age that she knew about. A girl named Rebecca. She'd gone to live in Kentucky after the war. Grandmama wrote to her once, years later. Rebecca wrote back a strange letter, said she felt like she was living on borrowed time, said she could feel something waiting for her, patient and eternal. Rebecca died in 1891. Grandmama kept the obituary. The death was listed as accidental, but the letter Rebecca's daughter sent to Grandmama said Rebecca had torn out her own eyes before she died. Said she'd been screaming about the collection coming due. These fragments, discovered across 8 decades, painted a picture more complex than the original investigation could have captured. They suggested that Anthony Lockhart's death wasn't an isolated incident, but the culmination of a pattern that had stretched across generations. A pattern that might, conceivably, still be incomplete. Because if Silas Thornhill had marked children as late as 1863, and if the curse required 70 years to complete, then the final victim wouldn't have died until 1933. But records from that period are incomplete, dispersed, or lost. Did other marked individuals die in the 1920s and 1930s? Did any survive past their 70th anniversary, breaking the curse through sheer endurance or faith? Or are there descendants alive today who carry genetic memories of those terrible markings, feeling watched by eyes that died a century ago? The answers, if they exist, remain hidden in the scattered archives of the South, waiting for someone to piece them together. The case of Anthony Lockhart, the slave haunted by the witch eyes, remains one of the most documented yet unexplained mysteries in Tennessee history. The physical evidence is undeniable. The scarring on his body, the journals spanning decades, the consistent pattern of similar deaths among those marked by Silas Thornhill. The testimonies are numerous and consistent across decades and witnesses. Yet no definitive explanation has ever satisfied all the evidence. 3 primary theories have emerged over the years, each with devoted proponents and significant weaknesses. Theory 1. Supernatural curse. This interpretation takes Anthony's claims at face value. Silas Thornhill, through study of African spiritual practices and European occultism, discovered or created a genuine supernatural methodology for extending his awareness beyond death. By marking children through ritual scarification and accompanying incantations, he bound watchers, spiritual entities or fragments of his own consciousness, to observe through their eyes across their lifetimes. The 70-year time frame aligns with biblical concepts of a complete lifespan. After 7 decades of observation, the watchers would return to their master, bringing with them everything they'd witnessed. The physical eyes were required as anchors, hence the violent removal at the end of the cycle. Proponents of this theory point to the consistency of the evidence across multiple victims, the precision of the scarring patterns, the documented deaths following similar patterns, and the anomalies captured in Robert Kensington's photographs. They argue that dismissing supernatural explanation simply because it's uncomfortable doesn't make it less true. Critics note that no verifiable supernatural phenomena have been documented under controlled conditions, and that trauma-based psychological explanations account for most of the observed effects, without requiring belief in the paranormal. Theory 2. Systematic trauma and psychological control. This interpretation, favored by most academic researchers, views the witch eyes as an elaborate system of psychological torture designed to maintain control over enslaved people even after physical bondage ended. Silas Thornhill, recognizing that physical escape from slavery was becoming increasingly possible, created a mental prison that would last a lifetime. By performing painful, terrifying rituals on young children, Thornhill created deep traumatic associations. The scarring served as a permanent reminder. The rhetoric of being watched and facing eventual collection created perpetual anxiety. The specific 70-year time frame gave victims a countdown to their own destruction, ensuring they could never truly escape their past. The fact that some victims died around their anniversary dates reflects the power of psychosomatic illness and anniversary reactions, well-documented phenomena. In trauma psychology, Anthony's final acts were tragic but understandable responses to unbearable psychological pressure accumulated over a lifetime. This theory is compassionate and evidence-based. It acknowledges the very real suffering of the victims while providing rational explanation. Its main weakness is that it struggles to account for certain physical evidence, particularly the photographs showing anomalous lights, the precision of the scarring patterns suggesting advanced anatomical knowledge, and the burial of 7 skulls with ritual modifications. Theory 3. Medical experimentation framed as occultism. A less commonly discussed theory suggests that Silas Thornhill was conducting crude neurological experiments under the guise of occult ritual. His theological education and extensive library indicated intellectual curiosity. Perhaps he became fascinated with the mechanics of vision, consciousness, and the relationship between physical and mental processes. The markings on Anthony's body, particularly the secondary scars following optic nerve pathways, suggest someone attempting to map or manipulate neural structures. The ritual framework may have been theater, designed to terrorize subjects, while Thornhill pursued pseudoscientific inquiry into consciousness, vision, and control. The psychological damage created by these experiments, combined with anniversary-focused trauma responses, would explain the pattern of deaths. The burial of the 7 skulls with modified eye sockets suggests Thornhill was collecting specimens, studying the physical structures of eyes and surrounding cranial features. This theory treats Thornhill as a sadistic amateur neuroscientist rather than genuine occultist, arguably more horrifying because it's more plausible. Its weakness is that it doesn't fully explain the consistency of testimonies about paranormal phenomena, like the glowing eyes or the sense of presence that even investigators reported feeling. To this day, no consensus has emerged. The witch eyes of Obion County remain unexplained. Anthony Lockhart's grave lies unmarked somewhere in Union City Cemetery. The site of his cabin is now covered by a shopping center parking lot. Silas Thornhill's plantation ruins were bulldozed in the 1970s for commercial development. But the story persists. Local historians occasionally revisit the case. Descendants of those involved sometimes come forward with family documents. And on certain autumn evenings, according to some longtime residents of Obion County, if you drive the back roads near where Anthony's cabin once stood, you might glimpse strange lights in the woods, blue-green orbs that hang in the darkness like watching eyes. Perhaps they're just fireflies. Perhaps they're the reflection of headlights off falling leaves, or perhaps something created in those terrible rituals of the 1830s still lingers, still watches, still waits for anniversaries that may never come. We may never know the truth. But we remember Anthony Lockhart, a man who survived slavery only to be haunted by it for 67 years. A man who suffered in ways we can document, but perhaps never truly understand. His story deserves to be told, even if it can never be completely explained. If you've made it this far, thank you for taking this journey with me into one of America's darkest chapters. I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments. What do you believe happened to Anthony Lockhart? Was he victim of supernatural curse, psychological torture, or something else entirely? Your theories and perspectives help keep these stories alive and help us understand the complex, often terrifying intersection of history and human suffering. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that notification bell. We explore forgotten cases like this every week, mysteries that sit at the uncomfortable boundary between documented history and unexplained phenomena. Join our haunted community. Let's explore the shadows of the past together. Until next time, remember, some stories are never truly finished. They're just waiting for the next person brave enough to listen. This has been another journey into the unknown. Stay curious, stay skeptical, but most importantly, stay human.